Dr. Keith C. Ferdinand, the Gerald S. Berenson Endowed Chair in Preventive Cardiology at Tulane University in New Orleans. And I'm so pleased to speak with Dr. Alan Kim Johnson, University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa. We'll talk a little bit about his work. Hi, Dr. Johnson.
Good morning. How are you?
All right. Give me just a little short summary of what you're going to present.
Since this is a talk, I think that it would encompass, 50 years of research. I wanted to give just a very, very brief background is how I got into hypertension research via studying how the brain controls overall body fluid homeostasis and some happy experiments that we conducted many, many years ago. And from that work, I'm really going to focus on what we've been doing for the last 10 years. What we discovered about 10 years ago is that, like many things that we experience in life, our earlier events have consequences for later in life. And that occurs because the brain has a certain amount of adaptability, we call it neuroplasticity, to, in a sense, record our earlier events. And then that those events have consequences. And there are various forms of these memorial processes, or what we could refer to as learning. In other words, the brain learns things. And one of the simplest forms of learning is learning that involves sensitization. In other words, sensitization occurs when a stimulus is given, and then at some later time in life, that stimulus or a similar stimulus can be administered and you have an enhanced response. In the first case, when the stimulus is the same, it's called sensitization. When the second stimulus is a little bit different, but still a stimulus that we could refer to as a stressor, a second hit, if you will, that second hit causes a greater response. And we refer to that as response sensitization. And in essence, that's what we discovered in terms of the mechanisms involved in the brain about 10 years ago, that there are certain areas in the brain which we'd studied for a long time, as well as many other people, areas in the brain that form a neural network that control, in effect, sympathetic tone and sympathetic outflow. So that, in essence, that circuitry is activated when you get that second stressor to a greater extent. So we started out in adult animals. We would give a stimulus, terminate that stimulus, wait about a week, in some cases a little bit longer, but wait about a week and then test with a second stimulus. So we say that we induce a change in the brain and we have a delay, and then we look for expression of the response. And that expression is sensitized. And we found that to be the case for many, many different first hits versus second hits. The second hit for many, many different stimuli that could be different. In other words, cross-sensitization would occur. So we decided to begin to look over longer periods of time. And what we were curious about, if we really extend this, we can look during the perinatal stage. In other words, we could manipulate the mother's blood pressure and look at her offspring, or we can challenge the neonates and then look later in life. And in both of those cases, those challenges that we would give either to the mother via seeing the effects on the offspring, or to the offspring themselves, in both cases as adults, blood pressures would be normal. But if we challenged them with that second hit, then they showed sensitization. And the interesting aspect is it's only the males. Females are, in both cases, in adult animals, stimulus adult, perinatal stimulus adult. In all those cases, females are protected for the most part. We found one exception to that. These two systems, the brain renin-angiotensin system, as well as estrogen action in the brain, which we've also studied. Estrogen provides a protective effect against that remodeling of the brain, if you will, that, in other words, the neuroplasticity that men don't have. And we've pursued that in various ways. We won't really get into that in the talk, but those are other facets of this phenomena of sensitization.
I noted in the past you also mentioned sodium intake. How does that play a part in this reaction?
We have some evidence that, for example, if we sensitize the animal to a stimulus, initial hit. In other words, we induce the sensitization. If we put animals on a high sodium diet, they show this sensitized response. So again, our early environment can influence, the response to ingesting too much sodium. And so we know sodium. We've also found that to be true for high fat diets. In other words, obesity as a second hit. In those cases, it's interesting. In that particular case, not only males, but also females respond to that second stressor, that eliciting stimulus. But in many other cases, of course, females are protected.
This is wonderful research. It gives us a window of opportunity to better understand hypertension, which for the most part, we really don't have a specific etiology. Thank you for your wonderful research, Dr. Johnson, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.